Okay, this is going to be lesson 9.6 video notes, and we're going to be working on the quadratic formula today. Okay, now the quadratic formula looks really big and scary, but it really isn't that bad because we utilize our calculators quite a bit here. There's only going to be a few things that you're going to do by hand. Okay, so if you don't have that calculator handy, go ahead and get it because you're going to need it. All right, so quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4 times let's make that a little better, times c all over 2a, okay? Now, the question always comes up, if we're looking at this guy right here, okay, we know that we can solve this by factoring. Okay, so the question is, why would we worry about learning this when we know that we can just solve by factoring? Okay, but one of the things you have to keep in mind on factoring is that sometimes these aren't factorable. Remember when we were factoring and we had all of those prime problems that kept popping up here and there? Okay, so there are quadratics that has an exponent of 2, right? Quadratic, exponent of 2, that aren't factorable. So what do you do with those problems? All right, and we are going to use the quadratic. Now, the nice thing about a quadratic is it works for every single quadratic we have. Every single one. Doesn't matter if it's prime, factorable, doesn't matter. It will always work. Where factoring only works when it's factorable. Okay, so that is why we would use it, because it's always going to work for every problem. Okay, so now just to kind of show you here what's going on. If we look at this guy and we solve by factoring, and we just finished this lesson up here, we would find factors of negative 24 that get us negative 2. So 4 and 6 kind of pop into your head right away there, hopefully. And then if I make that 6 negative, that would add up to a negative 2 for the middle. So we know our factors would be x plus 4 and x minus 6. And again, that's still equal to 0. Okay, now just like we finished up doing, you're going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. And so we would end up with negative 4 and positive 6. Okay, so now we're going to do the exact same thing, but now we're going to try to do it with the quadratic, and let's see if we can get to these two solutions. Okay, now the first thing we have to understand when we're doing the quadratic formula is what the heck is all this a, b, and c mumbo jumbo? Where's that coming from? Okay, so if I look down on this guy real quick, okay, a, b, and c are just numbers. So the number in front of this x squared is your a. The negative 2 is going to be your b. And then the negative 24 is going to be your c. So it's always going to be in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if it's not already set up like that, you're going to need to go ahead and solve it, make it look like that. Okay, so we know that a is equal to 1. I'm going to go ahead and write it down here just so we have it. So a will equal 1, b is equal to negative 2, and our c value was equal to negative 24. Okay, all right, so now let's go ahead and plug it into that big, huge formula up there. So x equals negative b. So negative just simply means take the opposite of it. So if this is a negative 2, we're going to put a positive 2 down. So 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c. Okay, and that's going to be all over 2a, or in this case, 2 times 1. All right, so now our focus here to start with is going to be the inside, okay? We need to get an answer on the inside here, okay? So this is just calculator work. So go ahead and type it into your calculator, negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 24. Okay, and so what I'm getting on the inside here, I'm getting x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 100. And then on the bottom, the 2 times 1, I'm going to go ahead and make it a 2. All right, so the very first thing I do is I always just type in what's inside that square root, or what's inside that radical. Now I'm actually going to take the square root of 100. So I'm going to get x equals 2 plus or minus 10 divided by 2. Okay, so now at this point, this plus or minus business is telling us that there are 2 solutions. So we need to go ahead and break this up into 2 individual problems and solve them. Kind of write this off to the side here. So when we do this, So again, I'm going to break it up and kind of to the two problems. We've got x equals 2 plus 10, divide that by 2, and x equals 2 minus 10, and divide that by 2. So again, we're just breaking up that positive and negative. Okay? All right, so now we're going to go ahead and solve these. So on the top here, I end up with 12 divided by 2, or I end up with x equals 6. On the bottom here, I end up with negative 8 divided by 2, or x equals negative 4. And those are my two solutions. So now if we kind of go back up here and look at this, again, notice how you're getting the same answers by factoring or using the quadratic. Now, like I said, this guy right here will work for everything. I know it's a little long and drawn out. This is fabulous. If it's factorable, I would factor because that's going to be so much faster and easier to do. But this will work no matter what, okay? All right, so let's go down to the next example here. Now, the directions here do say give exact and approximate, and that will be when it's appropriate, so we'll kind of talk about that throughout this video. So let's go ahead and find A, B, and C. Okay, so my A value is 2, B is 5, and C is 3, so it's already set equal to 0, so that's cool. All right, so x equals negative b, or the opposite of b, so negative 5, plus or minus the square root of 5 squared. Again, I'm not worried about the parentheses because it's not negative. Minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a, or 2 times 2 in this case. So again, we're just plugging in a, b, and c. All right, let's go ahead and type inside there 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3. So on this one, I'm getting x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 1 divided by 4. So the square root of 1 is just 1. So really, I just have plus or minus 1 divided by 4. Okay, so now let's go ahead and break up into your two different parts here. We've got negative 5 plus 1 divided by 4. And that's, sorry, x equals. And x equals negative 5 minus 1 divided by 4. Okay? Now, we do expect you either to reduce fractions or decimals or whatever. So just make sure that if you leave it in fraction form that you reduce it. So in this case, we're going to end up with negative 4 divided by 4. So x equals negative 1. On this guy over here, we're going to end up with negative 6/4. So we're going to go ahead and reduce that to negative 3/2. Now, if you want to put negative 1.5, that's fine. Okay? Now, one of the things we have to talk about briefly here, and we're going to talk way more about this in a future lesson, is what does negative 1 and negative 1 and 3/2 mean, okay? So realize that everything we've been studying is quadratics. Quadratic is the form of a parabola, okay? So when we're looking at this, what this is saying, and this is a terrible example. In fact, I'm going to try to redraw that just a little bit. Okay, so what this is saying it is crossing at negative 1, and it is crossing at negative 1.5 or negative 3/2. So just keep in mind that a quadratic is going to be U-shaped. Okay, it's a parabola. It's going to be U-shaped, and those values we are finding is simply where does it cross the x-axis. Okay, and so it'll be the same thing up here. Whoops, on the top with this negative 4 and 6 business. Okay, so when I'm looking at this. What this is saying is it negative 4 here, sorry. So 1, 2, 3, negative 4, I have a point crossing, and at 6, I have a point crossing, and again, that means I would have a parabola or like a U-shaped curve going through those 2 points on the x-axis. So that's the purpose, and that's kind of where we're going to be going with this information. Okay? All right, let's go over to page 2. All right, we're going to try it again. Now, looking on this one, you're going to notice that's not set equal to 0, so we need to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to get 15x squared minus 8x minus 4 equals 0. Again, I'm going to have A, B, and C. So I've got x equals opposite of 8, so it'll be positive 8 here because it was a negative 8. So positive 8 plus or minus negative 8 squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. Okay, so again, go ahead and work inside your parentheses there. So negative 8 squared minus 4 times 15 times negative 4. And I'm getting 304 in there. So x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 304 over 30. Okay, so now in this case, you know how to reduce this guy right here. You need to do that. Now, if your calculator will do that for you, absolutely fabulous. You can go ahead then and put the square root of 304 in there and find out that you're going to get x equals 8 plus or minus 4 root 19 over 30. Okay, now, if not, and you have got an older calculator, bummer, you are going to need to break this down. So I would do like 2 and 152, and then 152 divided by 2, and we're getting 2 and 76. And then 76 will be, let's see, I know 4 and 19. And so then the 4 will break to 2 and 2. So 2's pair up, right, and move out. So that's where that 4 on the outside's coming from. And then you have this 19 left over, and that's where the 19 is on the inside there, okay? Now, here's the deal, though. This is not completely done. And the reason it's not completely done is because we have an 8, a 4, and a 30 on the outside. If your 3 numbers on the outside can be reduced, you have to reduce it. Let me say that again. If all 3 numbers can reduce on the outside of that square root, you need to do that. If they can't all reduce by the same number, then don't worry about it. So for an example, if, let's just say for argument's sake, this was a 7, oops, that's highlighter in it. This was a 17 down here, you're done. Because 8, 4, and 17, you can't do anything with that. Okay, but unfortunately, that's not the case. It is a 30. So I know that 2 is going to come out of all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and divide them all by 2. So 8 is going to go to a 4. 4 will go to a 2, and 30 will go to a 15, okay? And this is your exact solution, okay? Remember, if you have a square root in the game, you have an exact, and then you have an approximate. So now to get the approximate, you're going to break it up. 4 plus 2 root 19, divide it by 15, and then 4 minus 2 root 19, and divide it by 15. Now, this is just calculator work at this point. If you've got a newer calculator, you can simply just type this all straight into your calculator. Use that fraction button there. And then double arrow it, and I'm getting 0.85 rounded off, okay? And so then we'll go down here, 4 minus 2, square root of 19, divide it by 15. Again, double arrow it if you've got one of the nicer calculators. And then we've got negative 0.3. Now, if you don't have a nicer calculator, you're probably going to have to start here with the 19, come up with that decimal, and then follow your order of operations. Multiply by 2, add the 4, and then divide by that 15. Okay? All right, so that one right there is the most complex problem we will be doing, okay? It's just if you can reduce the outside 3 numbers, you need to go ahead and do that. Oh, and I probably should go ahead and write down, so these 2 right here would be our approximate, okay? All right, let's try again. Okay, on this one, let's go ahead and subtract. The 9x needs to go ahead and move over, and remember, it's got to be in standard form. So x squared minus 9x plus 21 equals 0. So I've got x equals negative b. So right, your a value would be 1. B is negative 9. C is 21. So the opposite of b would be 9 plus or minus negative 9 squared minus 4 times a times c. All over 2a. Okay? All right. So now I've got 9 plus or minus. Let's go ahead and type this in. So negative 9 squared minus 4 times 1 times 21. Oh, and on the inside here, I have a negative 3. Now, think about that. Can you square root a negative number? The answer should be no. This is bad news. You cannot square root a negative number. So when that happens and you get a negative inside that radical, that's going to be a no solution. And so what a no solution simply means, like if we're talking about graphs here, it means no matter what, it will never, ever, ever cross this x-axis right here. So that's kind of what a no solution would look like. Okay, all right, next one. All right, we got A, B, and C here. So A, B, C. So x equals negative 24 plus or minus 24 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2a. So again, let's start by 24 squared minus 4 times 9 times 16. And I got a 0. So I have negative 24 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 18. Now think about that for a second. I mean, plus or minus 0, the square root of 0 is 0. So really what we have here is negative 24 over 18. Okay? So now you either need to reduce your fraction and make it negative 4/3, or you can give me the decimal answer of negative 1.3 repeating. Rounded it off. Okay, so either one of these I would take as your final answer. Okay, so now that's weird though, because everything I've been telling you says a quadratic should have 2 answers. So what's happened here when we're looking at a graph here, and we were at, so right between there, is you've got a parabola that's just sitting right on that line. So technically there are 2 answers normally, but in this case it just happens to be the same one. So that's what that will look like when you only get one answer. Okay? All right, let's go to the next page here. Okay, so I wanted to address this. What happens when we've got something missing? Okay, so in this case, your A value is still 1. Your X is what's missing in the middle. So since you have no X's, that means your B value will have to be 0. And then your C value will be negative 16. Okay, so if something is missing, then just make that guy a 0. Okay, so I've got X equals negative B. So remember your B value is 0 because it's missing. Plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. Okay, so X equals, all right, let's work the inside there. So I'm going to take basically just the 4 times the 16 there. I've got 0 plus or minus the square root of 64 divided by 2. 2 times 1 is 2. So I end up with the square root of 64 is 8. So now in this case, you can break it up, but really it's just saying positive 8 divided by 2 and negative 8 divided by 2. So my answers here are going to be X equals 4 and X equals negative 4. Now, if you don't like that and you want to put the 0 in front, please go ahead and do so. That's fine. Okay. All right, kind of moving on here. Okay, so on discriminant, okay, the discriminant is simply the number under the radical symbol or radical sign, okay? So back up here, our number underneath the radical sign here was 64. So just basically what number's inside that square root, okay? That's what's called the discriminant. And it's going to tell you the number of solutions. Whoops. Still got the highlighter on there. Number of solutions. Okay. All right. So if we kind of look at this table here, okay, one of the things we need to talk about first off, what is underneath the square root? Like what's part of that formula? So if you look underneath the radical there, you see b squared minus 4ac. Okay. So that is the discriminant. Okay. So again, the discriminant, if here, this is your quadratic, right? Your discriminant is simply what is on the inside right here. Okay, so b squared minus 4ac is your discriminant value. And so what this is saying is this is a fancy way of saying if your discriminant is positive. Okay, so if your discriminant is positive, you are going to get 2 real solutions or 2 solutions. Okay, if your discriminant is equal to 0, okay, equal to 0, then you're going to get 1 solution. And then if your discriminant is less than 0, or if your discriminant is negative, you are going to get no solutions, okay? And so this kind of just picture shows you what the different graphs are going to kind of look like, and we already started talking about it. The no solution just means it's never going to actually touch that x-axis. We talked about that if it sits right on there, that means we only have 1 answer. And then here it's showing, look, it's crossing here and here, so there's 2 solutions. So again, 2 solutions, 1 solution because it's sitting right on the x-axis. This guy never touches the x-axis, so it's a no solution. Okay, and what they're going to do is just ask you to simply find the discriminant value and then tell how many answers or how many solutions you should get. Oh, and I forgot an equal sign on this one. So let's go ahead and put an equal 0 in on this guy for me, please. Okay, so again, here's A, B, and C. Now, keep in mind, we don't have to look at the entire quadratic now. We can just focus in on that b squared minus 4ac, which is inside the square root. So I've got negative 2 squared minus 4 times 4 times 14. Okay, so now type that in your calculator. And my discriminant value here is going to be negative 220. Okay, so now if you can't remember, go back over to your chart and look. But if it's a negative, remember, that means it's got no solutions. It can't touch it. It's impossible. Okay, so in this case, your discriminant is negative 220, and you're going to have, not 2, you're going to have 0 solutions here because it will never touch. Okay, so that's what the directions are asking for. They want the discriminant value, and then how many answers would you get if we graphed it. Okay, again though, it does have to be set equal to 0. So I've got x squared plus 24x plus 144 equals 0. So now A is 1, B is 24, and C is 144. So when we use the B squared minus 4AC, right? So 24 squared minus 4 times 1 times 144. All right, so let's type that into your calculator real quick. So 24 squared minus 4 times 1 times 144. And I ended up with a 0 there. So 0 is telling us that we have one solution. It will hit that x-axis one time. Okay, and last problem finally. Okay, again, let's make sure this is set equal to 0. So let's subtract the 12 over to the other side here and get 3x squared plus 10x minus 12 equals 0. So we have got A, B, and C. So again, B squared minus 4AC, well, that's the discriminant value underneath the square root. So I've got 10 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 12. So I end up with negative 44 when I type that all in. And since it's a negative, it means it can have 0 solutions, okay? Because you cannot have a negative underneath the square root, okay? All right, and that concludes these notes.